All right, welcome in Falcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim, and I'm your host, David McDonnell. And this is May the 9th, second podcast in the month of May, 2021. And it's my half hour to tell some stories, some historical tidbits, news of the day, some yarns, some legends, and obviously my random thoughts. Now, the big news today here in County Antrim is that we did not get hit by a Chinese rocket. It did not land on my head, and I was nervous about it for quite a while. I actually heard a newscaster yesterday say, semi-exact quote, she said the Chinese rocket is expected to crash somewhere on the globe. Somewhere on the globe. And that, when I heard that, I said, what the fuck? I said, that gives me no place to hide if it's going to land somewhere on the globe. Later in the day on my computer, I saw a headline, and it said that it was going to land within the red zone. So I figured maybe they've narrowed it down a little bit. So where in the planet is the red zone, I asked. Well, it turns out the red zone is a band on both sides of the equator, and it doesn't extend all the way up to Michigan. I live right around the 45th parallel. And the red zone was kind of below that, so maybe the 44th parallel or something. And extended from there down to the equator, and then from the equator down to the 44th parallel on the other side. So included most of the planet, but not all of it. Went all the way down to Australia, for that matter. But it did not include Michigan, so I knew I was safe. But I was still hoping, obviously, that it wouldn't crash into some populated area. And it turns out, as you should know by now, it crashed in the Indian Ocean. So no one was hurt, at least not directly. But don't forget about the butterfly effect. It's a chaos theory. It just basically says that a small change somewhere can create an enormous change somewhere else. So what possibly could be the butterfly effect of this rocket crashing in the Indian Ocean? I don't know. It may have scared away a lot of fish. And the fish may be swimming in a different direction. And maybe a whale was chasing the fish, so the whale is now swimming in a different direction. Maybe the whale crashed into a fishing vessel and capsized the vessel. And then some huge container ship rammed into the fishing vessel, the capsized fishing vessel, and the collision was big enough that a container fell off the container ship. And whatever was on that container, whatever was lost on that container ship, may have caused a disruption of some sort in the supply chain. And the result of which, I just won't get the Amazon package I was expecting next week. Who knows? But that maybe is the catastrophe to me because of the Chinese rocket crashing in the Indian Ocean. Anyway, today, actually last week, I told you a Celtic fairy tale, and I'm going to tell you another one tonight, and then I'll move on to something else next week. But I'm going to tell you a Celtic fairy tale called The Shepherd of Erne. Now, in the flatlands and the wetlands of County Fermanagh, there's lies a lake known as Loch Erne. It's where the River Erne widens as the water flows from the mountains all the way to the Atlantic. Now, there are many, many legends surrounding how Loch Erne was formed, and who is to know which one is true. It was perhaps formed when Lady Erne and her maidens were frightened by a large giant, and they ran away into the River Erne, where they drowned, and their bodies were dissolved, forming the lake. Or perhaps it was formed when the giant Finn McCool scooped up a chunk of earth, to throw at his Scottish rival, and he picked it up and heaved it as far as he could to land on his foe in Scotland, but it didn't make it. That chunk of dirt landed in the middle of the Irish Sea, and that formed the Isle of Man. And the crater left behind is what formed Loch Erne. But be that as it may, the land surrounding the lake just provides ample feed for sheep, and it was there that a shepherd led his lambs. And one day he simply just laid along the shore of the lake whilst his sheep sought pasture. Now suddenly the shepherd saw 3 maidens rise above the shore of the lake. And each of the 3 of them just shook their head to take droplets off their hair as they came out of the water. And each of them came out of the water and walked among the sheep. And they were the most beautiful maidens that the shepherd had ever seen before. But he was most filled with love and adoration for the one that just seemed to have walked closest to him. And the shepherd offered that maiden a piece of bread that he had. And she took it and she tried it. But then she sang to him, "Hard baked is thy bread. It's not easy to catch me." And with that she laughed and ran off back into the lake. Now the next day the shepherd returned with his flock, and he brought with him some bread that was not so well done. And he watched and waited for the maidens. And when they came ashore, one came closest to him, and he offered her a piece of that bread. And the maid tasted it and said, "Unbaked is thy bread. I will not have thee." And she again laughed and disappeared into the lake. Now the third time the shepherd tried to attract the maiden, he offered her bread that he had found floating on the lake. It was a bit soggy. And he offered that to her, and it pleased her. And she promised to become his wife and said, "If you can pick me out from my identical sisters from the lake." Now the shepherd was quick to notice that she had straps on her sandals that were a little bit different than the other 2 lake maidens. And sure enough, the next day, the shepherd correctly picked out the maiden. She then promised to be as good a wife to him as any earthly woman could possibly be. Unless, though, she added, unless he struck her 3 times without cause. Now, of course, he promised he would never strike her with or without cause. And upon such a promise, the maiden summoned 3 cows, 2 oxen, and a bull from the lake. And they all came out of the lake. This was going to be her marriage dowry. And she followed the shepherd as his bride, together with her cows, oxen, and her bull. Now years passed happily, and 3 sons were born to the shepherd and his lake maiden. And one day, going to a christening, she said to her husband that it was too far to walk. So he said, "Well, go for the horses." And she said, "I will, if you bring me my gloves, which I left in the house." So the shepherd went into the house, retrieved the gloves, came back outside, tapped her on the shoulder, and said, "Here are your gloves." And she said, "That's one." Now the shepherd was quite surprised at this, at her response. He certainly remembered promising never to strike her, but he was surprised that a tap on the shoulder counted as the first strike. And he tried to remember, all the years they'd been together, had he ever tapped her shoulder before? And he tried to remember, and he just, try as he might, he could not remember ever tapping her on the shoulder before. Now, sometime later, the shepherd and his wife were at a wedding. And with all the joy and the mirth which surrounded this joyous occasion, she began to sob and to weep. And her husband tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Why do you weep so?" And she said, "I was weeping for the joy of the wedding. But now I am weeping because trouble is upon you. That is the second causeless blow you have given me. Be careful, for the third is the last." So the husband, again surprised at his faux pas, his mistake, he was careful never, ever to strike her again. And he refrained from doing so for quite some time. There was a time, though, that they went to a funeral for a friend, and during the funeral, the wife just burst out laughing. And the husband kind of touched her firmly on the shoulder this time, saying, Is this time for laughter?" And she said, "I laugh because those that die go out of trouble. But your trouble has come. The last blow has been struck, and our marriage is at an end." Now with that, she rose up and returned to her home. Once there, she called for her cows and her oxen and her bull. Now, one of the cows had just been slaughtered, was hanging on a hook in the barn. But when she called for it, it got off of the hook and followed her. And the oxen were in the field, still had the plow attached to them, and they too followed her, pulling the plow the whole way to the lake. And the bull was within a fence, and it just crashed through the fence and followed her as well. Now, to this very day, no cow has been slaughtered at the home of the shepherd. And the fence that the bull crashed through has yet to be mended. And the furrow made by the oxen from the home of the shepherd all the way to Loch Erne is still there, can still be seen. And the maiden with her oxen and her cows and her bull returned to the lake. And the maiden has never returned from the lake. Now that's the story of the shepherd of Loch Erne. An ancient story. Now it's actually an ancient Welsh tale. It's entitled in Welsh, The Shepherd of Mudvie. And Mudvie is a village in southern Wales. And the maiden rose out of a lake. It's called Llyn y Fan Fach. It's a relatively small lake high in the Black Mountains in the south of Wales. And the story is included in what's called the Red Book of Hergest. It's believed to have been written between the years 1382 and 1410. So the book itself is over 600 years old. And who knows how long or how old the tale actually is. And the Red Book of Hergest is in Welsh language, and it contains a whole collection of medieval prose and poetry and stories. It's called the Red Book because it has a reddish leather binding. And possession of the book passed over the centuries in many hands, but for a time it was held by the Vaughns, the Vaughan family of Hergest Court, and hence the name, the Red Book of Hergest. It's now in Oxford College in England, very valuable piece of antiquity. Now, the manuscript also includes a collection of herbal remedies and stories behind use of those herbal remedies. And the first to use those herbal remedies, according to the Red Book, was a man called Rhiwacton. And again, it's in Welsh, and I hope I'm pronouncing that even close to correctly, but I believe his name is Rhiwacton. And he lived in Mudvee in the 12th century. And he had these herbal medicinal skills, and he passed them on to his sons, who passed it on to their sons, etc., etc. And that created a dynasty of physicians, which are known as the physicians of Mudvee. And the last one of those physicians died in the year 1739. So that's about 600 years in which the physicians of Mudvee healed folks in South Wales. Now, the physicians of Mudvee is part true, part legend. I mean, they were indeed healers in that region. And they applied herbal remedies, herbal medicines. And they wrote their recipes down, so they're still available, because from the Red Book, they're still available today to see what recipes, what cures were used 600, 700, 800 years ago. And these remedies were used by local physicians for generation after generation. Many, many years they practiced medicine in Wales. Now here's the part that's a legend. Where did Rhiwacton, the first physician of Mudvee, where did he learn these herbal remedies? Where did he come up with them before he could pass them on to his son and then their sons and their sons, etc.? Well, he learned these herbal remedies from his mother, the Lake Maiden. You see, the story, the Shepherd of Mudvee, is really more of a preface to a story rather than a complete story. Because the larger story is about these physicians who for generations cured the sick. And the original tale had after the third striking and the disappearance of the Lake Maiden, the original story had the sons of the shepherd circling the lake from time to time, looking for their mother. And she appeared once to her eldest son, Rhiwacton. Appeared to him once, and she gave him a gift. And the gift she gave him was her knowledge of herbs and the use of them in healing. And she actually gave him some herbs. I don't know what herbs grow at the bottom of a lake, but whatever they were, she gave them to him. And it was that knowledge that he acquired, that he passed on to his brothers and the sons and their sons, etc., for generation after generation. And that's a much abbreviated version of the story of the physicians of Mudvee. So as you see from the story that I told, I took some liberties with that story. I thought ending the story with the mother passing on her gift of healing to her sons kind of left the story hanging. If you just know that part of the story, ending it with her giving him a gift of healing just kind of leaves it hanging in the air. So I ended the story with the Lake Maiden never returning again. And that's the way I'll tell the story, and when I tell it orally, if I ever get to tell it orally. Unless I'm willing to tell the whole story, which is about the physicians and their generations of healing, with their herbs and their recording of their recipes. I also changed the setting from Wales to Ireland, mainly because I'm unfamiliar with Wales. I've never been there, and I'll get there someday, but I haven't been there yet. And as you can see from my stumbling, I'm not sure how to pronounce a lot of Welsh words and Welsh names. But it also gave me an opportunity to just give you a couple teasers about some Irish legends and the formation of Irish lakes. The first teaser I gave you was the drowning of Lady Erne. It's one of the several legends surrounding the founding or the formation of Loch Erne. Loch Erne really is not a lake in the traditional sense, and there really are two Loch Ernes. There are both spots where the River Erne just kind of widens, and it widens big enough that it looks more like a lake than a river. And Lady Erne was a goddess, and she and a few of her maidens were frightened by a hideous giant. And they ran away, and they fled into the river. And in the river they drowned. And their bodies dissolved because of her divine power, because Lady Erne was a goddess. And that gave more life to the river, hence the expansion of the river into a lake. And such is one of the legends of Loch Erne. The second teaser involved Finn McCool. About a month or so ago, I told you the legend of Knockmany. It's where Finn McCool, through the cunning of his wife, beat his Scottish rival, Benadonner. It's one of the many legends in the Finian cycle. Another legend has Finn McCool angry at a Scottish rival. May or may not have been Benadonner, I don't recall. Finn McCool was so angry, he picked up a mound of earth, and his intent was to throw it all the way to Scotland. He picked up a mound of earth in Ireland, heaved it as hard as he could, but it didn't make it all the way to Scotland. It landed in the Irish Sea, and it forms the Isle of Man, which, if you don't know your geography, the Isle of Man is an island about halfway between Ireland and Scotland. Now, the crater formed by the earth that Finn McCool picked up created Loch Ness, and it's Ireland's largest lake is Loch Ness. So Finn McCool obviously was a giant of a man, but I thought I'd give you a teaser of that legend by adding it to this story and applying it to Loch Erne rather than Loch Ness. I think I'm running out of time, but I'm just telling you, Loch Ness is it's in Northern Ireland. There's a nature preserve there at the south end of the lake called the Oxford Island National Nature Reserve. And I hiked the reserve a few years ago, and I also did some bird watching there. The reserve is a breeding ground for a whole variety of species, and particularly waterfowls. And it was a lot of fun just hanging out there for an afternoon. And that reminds me of a story that I'll probably tell you. Maybe I'll even do it next week. So if we're talking about bird watching, I think I'll tell you a story of the falcons of County Antrim. It's an ancient story, but it has relevance today. So what's my time here? I'm just about to. Well, maybe I can make a couple more comments. I want to respond to a comment I got from a listener. Because a few weeks ago, I compared Irish festivals and Scottish festivals, and I noted the differences. And someone thought I might have been too harsh or too negative in my comments about Scottish festivals, and I didn't mean to be negative. I simply wanted to note that they were different. And I don't know if the differences illustrate the difference between Irish people and Scottish people, or the difference between Irish Americans and Scottish Americans, or if it's simply the differences between the people who get motivated enough to organize these kinds of festivals in North America. But my role is the same in either one, and I enjoy both, because I don't sing or dance, and I can't lift up, let alone throw a telephone pole to compete in the Highland Games. And so my role is to tell stories, and I find that patrons at these festivals, either one of them, are very eager to learn more about their heritage. Maybe that explains why Ancestry.com and so forth and various DNA testing devices are so popular, because people are eager to get in touch with their heritage. So they enjoy hearing stories in the tradition of the Celtic Shanachie, and they enjoy the historical presentations and the folklore and the legends. And I try to make them as entertaining as I can. And I also bury in my stories somewhat something I call disguised learning. I'll take factual information, even if I'm telling a fantasy or a legend or a yarn. I'll put in a couple of bits of historical information for context. And it gives the audience just a little better feel for what it was like to live in bygone eras. All right, I am running. I got a few more minutes. I guess I'd make one more comment. Because one of the things I get asked a lot at these festivals, or the comment I get at a lot of these festivals, is someone will say to me, I'm not Irish, I'm Scottish. Or they'll say, I'm not Scottish, I'm Irish. And my response is always the same. Because if you're Irish, you're Scottish. And if you're Scottish, you're Irish. And you probably are also part English, part Norman, part Welsh, part Norwegian, part Danish, and probably part of a lot of other things. It just reflects the movement of people for hundreds or thousands of years. And the Scots and the Irish moved back and forth across the North Channel so many times over 2+ millennia. I think what I'll do at a future podcast is just talk about some of the more significant migrations, movements back and forth, and it'll show you why an awful lot of people who may have originally been from Scotland ended up in Ireland, and why so many people in Ireland, originally from Ireland, ended up in Scotland. But that'll be another podcast. So I'm going to wrap it up. Please take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email if you have questions, comments, complaints at clandonald@gmail.com. Buy my books, Clandonald and Buy the Horse of Guinness. Like me on Facebook and like this video if you don't mind. So that's it for tonight, and I'll be back again next week. Goodbye.